Hi, how are
Hey,
you?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you as well. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Did you have a good one?
Yes, I did. How about you?
Yeah, I did, thank you. First day back in work, so yeah, you can just
Same.
just bear with me.
Yes, I know. Getting back into it. And were you off the whole week between Christmas and New Year's or?
I only worked for one day, so that was last Wednesday. But yeah,
Okay,
it's it
yeah, kind of
feel
same
it,
here.
yeah, it does feel like I haven't worked for like 2 weeks for some reason. I don't know. It feels like I haven't been in work for ages. But yeah, so yeah, good to reconnect with you. I was quite keen to bring it on just because certainly when we met at the conference last couple of months ago, we obviously didn't have a chance to really speak. But I admire some of your social media presence. I was just doing an introduction just now, telling people about your some of the amazing posts that you put out, particularly on your Instagram page, and suggesting for people to follow you under Hummingbird ADHD. So what I wanted to talk about today is a few things. If we can start off with the burnout, ADHD and burnout. And also, I'm quite keen to talk about being diagnosed with ADHD later in life, and also focus around the challenges that brings, waiting for that long, or being diagnosed, and also maybe we can maybe share some tips or strategies or anything that you might want to maybe share with our listeners. Does that sound all right with you?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Good, perfect. So, if maybe we can start off by you just telling us about a bit about yourself, and yeah, just how you came onto this kind of ADHD space.
Sure. So I am a mom of three living in the Phoenix, Arizona area in the US. I decided to start educating on ADHD a few years after I was diagnosed as an adult. I learned I had ADHD after going through the diagnostic process with my daughter. And when I was filling out all of her paperwork and having all the discussions with providers, I was like, wait a minute, this is describing me. This is making all of the challenges I've had my whole life make sense now. So I had already been working in a corporate training capacity, working with educating adults for most of my career and had done some entrepreneurship. So as soon as I learned the value of ADHD coaching after working with a coach myself, it made a lot of sense to transition into that space. And as a part of that, I started creating on Instagram and just finding that there was a lot of people out there that needed to learn more about ADHD.
And also being a female, being diagnosed with ADHD, I'm not sure. I'll probably ask you that in a second. But when you were diagnosed, in terms of like, did you face any challenges at all with people trying to understand how ADHD manifests, particularly in females? Is that something that people used to come to you and ask? And
Absolutely. So after going through that whole process of getting diagnosed with my daughter and then with myself, I learned early on that I really had to be very literate around how my symptoms were impacting me. I had to become an advocate for myself with my providers, with the people I was working for, with my own family, even to be able to help communicate what worked best for me and really also to just get certain people to believe that this is a real thing and that you could be almost 40-year-old woman that went her whole life not realizing she had ADHD. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of kind of ideas and stigmas around what ADHD is that just aren't accurate. So there was a lot of education I had to kind of embark on for myself and then also share with others to help those around me understand as well.
yeah, how long ago were you diagnosed?
I, gosh, how old am I now? About 6 years ago.
Right. And what's been your journey since being diagnosed? Obviously, you're doing amazing work trying to raise awareness and being an advocate. But your own personal journey, have you had support? Have you had treatment? How's that been for you for the last few years?
Yeah, I have done a lot of things actually. So the first thing I did prior to being diagnosed was um, start working with a coach. I really knew that there was a lot of unwinding that needed to happen with how I was living my life, how I thought about productivity and expectations for myself. And I knew I just needed to kind of find a different way to go about my everyday life and go about how I worked. So I did ADHD coaching right off the bat. I have also explored medications for myself, and I was really lucky that I have been a active person for many, many years. I discovered like the miracle of running for my brain when I was in my 20s and started running marathons. So I had that piece kind of already in place. And while I didn't realize it was helping my ADHD at the time, I did really realize it helped my energy and my focus and, getting me through the day. So continued to lean on those types of habits as well post diagnosis.
And lastly, just again, on a personal note, what's been useful for you? What have you found useful? You talked about exercise there. Anything else that you might want to share with people that you found useful?
Something that I think is really, really helpful is really starting to understand my capacity. And what I mean by that is how many appointments can I handle a day? How much can I actually put on my plate? And what types of things do they need to be to avoid constantly being in that cycle of burnout? So, for me, that looks like every Monday, I get out my calendar and I look at what actual appointments I have. I look at what I think I need to prioritize for the week. And I time block a lot of things. I also have had to learn to, say no to things, to set boundaries, to really, really dive into understanding myself and what I can take on so that I'm not constantly in that like stress cycle of trying to do too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think you touched on one thing there, saying no, and certainly over apologizing. That's something I saw one of your reels that you posted, I think it was on YouTube or on Instagram. But yeah, and I think how you put out your messages is through kind of humor, and I think people get it. When you watch some of
Mm-hmm.
your clips, it's like, yep, over apologizing, all of that, can't say no and stuff like that. So what spurred you on in terms of setting up particularly your social media? What was the driving force behind it? What was it that you're trying to put across by setting up your social media pages?
Well, it initially started because I had finished my coaching program through ADDCA at the very beginning of 2021. So we were still very much in a pandemic at the time. And the traditional avenues of marketing weren't going to work. I felt like at this time, like I wasn't going to be going into providers' offices and handing them my card and networking locally in that way. So I knew I needed to take a different approach. I also knew that I really loved to communicate information and teach, and that through my experience working in corporate training, I knew my gifts were in being able to throw in a little humor and then bring the facts so that it stays in our brain. And I knew I was good at that already. So, initially it was just to help, grow my coaching practice, but it turned into so much more for me. I was amazed at the connections I was making and also just how much people out there are craving community. I saw that really quickly with just people in my comments talking to each other, people in my DMs, and it really like changed the direction of my focus in my business within the first year of creating on Instagram.
Yeah, yeah, and I've spoken to a lot of people on this podcast as well, and that's what I find that's the good thing about social media. Obviously, there's ups and downs to it, but on the upside, it's is way of kind of passing out, sharing information, particularly for something like ADHD that's still quite misunderstood to some extent
Mhm.
by, the little things that you post that you say, are you, do you do this? And it's just how you do it that maybe get people to go, it's quite relatable as well. Although it's quite fun, it's quite funny, but
Mhm.
it's quite relatable. So I think yeah, you've done well. You got over 160,000 K followers on your pages and things, so which is great. Moving things swiftly on because obviously I wanted to focus on the topic that we want to discuss today, which is burnout. And I think it ties in link nicely with some of the things that we said about not being able to say no. So in your opinion, why do you think a lot of people with ADHD or ADHDers are prone to burnout?
Oh my gosh, there are so many reasons.
Yeah.
I think our society right now is burning a lot of people out, whether you have ADHD or not, right? So we already have that. And then we have all of these other struggles that contribute. So there is like the actual ADHD symptoms that I think can make it very hard for us to not be burned out, like our issues with like self-regulation, regulating our attention and focus all day. So we work differently than our typical population. We tend to like get hyper focused and get a ton done in a short period of time, but then we have to recover. And a lot of times our jobs don't honor that, and our, patterns don't honor that. We also are struggling with like emotional regulation a lot. So that can mean that at work, if we're dealing with a lot of emotional regulation over projects and timelines and just conversations, we're dedicating a lot of resources into having to regulate. And that's exhausting. A lot of times, I think too, there's that other piece that it's not the actual ADHD symptoms, it's the behaviors that we kind of develop as a result of these symptoms and trying to mask them, or just like how we've been socialized that also contribute. So that would be like the people pleasing that we talked about, the not being able to say no, the putting way too much on our plate that's not realistic. And that kind of all comes together like and creates this situation where we're always doing too much and we're not recovering properly.
Yeah. Is that something you've experienced yourself personally?
Yeah, a lot. So
Yeah.
I mentioned my career in corporate training, but I've also done a lot of forays into entrepreneurship, and I ran two successful businesses prior to this one, but I always quit because of burnout, not because I wasn't achieving what I wanted to in that business. And I knew I was burned out. I recognized that. I had no idea it had anything to do with ADHD. So I didn't quite understand the burnout to be able to make changes. So it's been a big thing for me. What's different now is I can see it and I can understand it better. So I purposely run my life in a way that avoiding burnout's like a huge priority for me. It's something that I take really, really seriously. So and I think that's really important for most ADHDers to truly understand what's going on with burnout.
In terms of the early signs of burnout, because obviously I think it's quite crucial to maybe spend time discussing that before it gets to the point where you completely like crash in and you can't really do much after that. What are some of the signs that most ADHDers tend to experience that might then lead into a full-blown sort of burnout?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to look out for. And I think you're very correct that it's better if we can focus on burnout prevention than burnout recovery. It's much easier to prevent. Um, One thing I think that is really ADHD specific is that a lot of us struggle with working memory. Uh, Anytime, right? That's just a feature of ADHD. When that seems to really, really ramp up, where you're having a lot of moments where you're like, I don't know why I walked into this room. I don't know you're staring at your computer. You're like, I don't know what I was doing. And you're struggling to apply that information in the moment. I think that can be a sign. If you are experiencing a harder time sleeping than usual, I think that is a big contributor. Another one that I think is really important in the context of ADHD is if you're feeling really apathetic. So things that you used to be excited about, um, things that weren't hard for you to do in like a normal day, if you suddenly just don't feel like you want to do any of those things, sometimes apathy is a sign that you're getting burned out on what you're doing as well.
It's obviously quite tricky sometimes where some of these traits could be indicating something completely different as well.
Totally.
You could be having signs of depression for, like
Hmm.
what I think the symptom that you mentioned there, some of the physical signs, the lack of sleep, maybe you might be losing your appetite, or, you might be getting more irritable than usual. You might be finding that yeah, I think it feels like everything's just overwhelming you and you're just shutting down at that point. And
Yeah.
I think, yeah, yeah. So, and it can be quite difficult, as I said, for them to attribute that to I'm feeling burnt out and to actually say, right, okay, I need to discuss this or I need to stop, I need to recharge and stuff. So, which in your experience, obviously, because you're a coach, when you speak to clients through your work, at what point do they actually realize? At what point does the penny drop to say, wow, I'm starting to feel burnt out? Is it at the point where it's actually unbearable, or is it just from talking to your clients? At what point do they usually experience it, or does it just?
I mean, I think there usually are signs. It really depends on the client and if they're coming to me and they've already kind of been ignoring these signs for a long time. And I'm always, as a coach, making sure that my clients are also working with a mental health provider, like a psychiatrist, a therapist as well, because of what you talked about. These can be signs of other things. They can even be signs of like physical illness as well. So it is important to always kind of like look at the big picture and make sure people are receiving the care they need, from like a psychiatrist if depression is a concern. Typically, if a client's coming to me and they're like, I'm starting to notice these signs, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I typically will work out with them on making some small changes first and kind of how they're going about their day to day. I also think it's really, really important to figure out what exactly is burning you out. Do you have way too much on your plate? Are you not taking care of like your physical needs? And so your body is kind of like talking to you. Are you really bored? Is it more like a bore out type situation than a burnout situation? And finding kind of the big things that are contributing to the burnout, I think is important in identifying that and then helping a client apply small changes. When we're in the early stages of burnout, because once
Mhm.
we have a lot of things going on, we can't change everything all at once, right? And it can be hard to
Yeah.
address. That's why I think prevention is definitely the way to go.
I think there's this societal pressure as well that as an adult, particularly you have lots of responsibilities in the case for, people that are parents or you got work and stuff and you have to juggle. So to some extent, you as an adult, you might just think this is just being an adult, I just have to juggle it all and, I'm expected to do this. And again, going back to the whole point about being, in the society where we don't ask for help. And I think asking for help is seen as a weakness, which can cause you to just take,
Mhm.
and not really kind of utilize friends, anyone, people around you, as well, which can contribute to you feeling burnt out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's important too when you're starting to feel that little bit of burnout, especially if you just have a ton of responsibilities. Like I have 3 kids, I have a job, like I'm not the only one doing that. A lot of people are trying to do a lot. There's a lot of pressure to do a lot of things, is to first ask yourself, is this like kind of a temporary thing? Like am I just having a really busy month? Is this just like a season? And I know there's like an endpoint where there's going to be less asked of me. And sometimes it's important to like see that and then make just small changes for self-care to kind of get you through, like you said, to ask for help. I also think it's really important when we think about that societal pressure too, to recognize when we're doing things because we think we should versus have to, right? Like we do need to feed our kids every day. We do need to like make a living and pay our bills. Those things are not like super optional, but like do we need to go super overboard for every holiday? Do we need to participate and try to put on like this persona and be the PTO mom and do all of these other things too? Or do we just think we should and society is expecting that of us? So we have to get good at like really discerning what our priorities are and what the most important things are as well.
Yeah. A lot of individuals that I speak to with ADHD, they struggle with just relaxing, like what you're saying, just take some time out to look after yourself. Self-care is very crucial. I agree. Um, but some people thrive from being busy, but they don't know the limits. Obviously, it has to be in moderation, doesn't it? So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, too much of one thing, like if you're constantly on the go and you can't relax and you can't have time for yourself, can lead to obviously feeling burnt out to some extent, isn't it?
Yeah,
Can it?
absolutely. So it's like what you're communicating is making me think of what I refer to as the impulsive yes. Oftentimes it's not people pleasing necessarily. Like we actually want to do all of these things. We feel good when we're busy. We're excited about a lot of different projects. And that can be a burnout contributor too, because even though you're doing a lot of things you want to do, we still need to sleep. We still need to eat. We still need to rest. Like that, we really will burn out if we say yes to all of the things. So having some kind of process for evaluating your yes, or even just A strategy to pause before you commit to things, I think is really, really important. That impulsivity definitely that we experience with ADHD can get us into a cycle where we're doing too much, or we just, like you said, you want to do these things. You feel good when you're busy, but we all need to leave space for the things that are going to come up that we're not expecting. Because if we're so busy because we're doing all these things we want to do, and then life happens, we get sick, and then we are so committed, then we have no breathing room, and it can definitely burn us out quickly.
What's the importance of routine and structure? Certainly for someone with ADHD, that can also help preventing them from feeling burnt out.
Yeah, I think routines are super helpful. I think it's sometimes easier said than done for people with ADHD. We have to kind of look at routines a little bit differently, and be willing to tweak them when necessary. But a routine can really help us, one, make sure that those self-care things are happening, like that we are getting movement in our day, we are getting to bed at a decent hour and doing things to help us in that way. And routines can also take a little bit of pressure off of our brain, I think, to have to make a lot of decisions. So if we know this is what our mornings look like, then we're not struggling with that decision fatigue that I think is common with ADHDers, because sometimes we have a hard time choosing. We have a hard time prioritizing. If we have a routine, that kind of gives us a structure that takes away some of that pressure, and it's just less mental energy that we have to expend. So routines can be super helpful.
Yeah. Three words tend to spring to mind when I think about all of what we're discussing. One is time blindness. The other one is decision paralysis, and the other one is consistency. I think when you factor in all three, and when you have a typical day and you've got all the other responsibilities you're trying to juggle, it's a juggling act that you having to um, trying to kind of dedicate and allocate your time effectively to be able to attend to everything that you need to attend to, which leads to having a good structure and being mindful of, if am I losing track of time? Am I spending a lot of time hyper focusing on one thing and stuff like that, which is quite difficult for someone with ADHD. How would they actually go about be more kind of conscious. One, I think you have to be conscious of time, don't you? The first thing, you need to be able to prioritize, okay, what do I need to attend to? And be mindful that I'm spending a lot of time and pull yourself back and go, right, okay, I need to move on to the next, or I need to give myself a break. And it's a lot to juggle if you think about it, just in one typical day, let alone in a whole week, which can
Yeah.
also lead to burnout.
Totally, it is. It's a ton to juggle. And that's why I think it's so important for us to spend some time understanding these things. The time blindness one first, I think that is something that we really have to accept about ourselves with ADHD, and stop trusting ourselves to know how long things are going to take. I really encourage clients to look at their calendar, and like if you use a digital calendar, grab like a paper calendar that's just like a day, hour by hour, and write your meetings in so that you can see the time. So sometimes you're like, okay, I glanced at my Google Calendar and I've got like 3 meetings. I have tons of time today. But then when you look at how they're stacked, you're like, oh, I've only got 30 minutes here and 30 minutes there. And then there's this. So like sometimes we need that visual. We need to almost like externalize time a little bit. So taking that extra step to like see time, I think can help. I also really like using visual timers because that can kind of help us be able to, like when we're working on a task, and like you said, we just like get lost in time, we get hyper focused. If we've got a visual timer, if we're just glancing at that, we're like, oh, okay, we can like really see how time is going away, versus like having a timer on our phone when it's time to switch, and then we're just like jumped out of that hyper focus and it doesn't feel good and we're mad, we don't want to do it. Like if we can kind of like self-regulate in that way, I think that helps a lot. I also think it's really important that at times we have accountability with people that understand what a day looks like for us, so that at times if we're really struggling, like, I don't know if I can put this project here, or I don't know if I can commit to that, who can we talk to that will be real with us and be like, actually, I do think you've got a pocket of time there that should work, or have someone be like, no, that is absolutely not realistic, because it really is such a struggle for us. I heard that you also mentioned consistency. I think that's a tough one for us with ADHD. I really encourage my clients to move away from the word consistency and embrace like persistence instead, because we're going to have a hard time, being the same every day. We're just usually not those people. We are going to have days where we're really, really focused and we're getting a ton done, but then our brain is going to need to like go a little bit slower the next day. And when we don't fight that so much, we actually save some kind of like mental, resources. So understanding that you've got like some plan A's and plan B's for the type of focus day you're having, I think can really help. And then just to keep moving forward and not give up on a routine
Yeah.
or something helps, because you can't do it exactly the same every single day. Um, I like to say, like, have a couple versions of your routine. Have your like bare minimum routine and have your routine when you wake up and you're feeling great. And that way you're holding space for that routine and it's not going away, but you're leaving kind of some realism there for the fact that it's not going to look the same constantly. And I think the last point you made was decision paralysis. That's a big one. I think that can be tough. That prefrontal cortex of ours, like that's one of those executive functioning, prioritizing is really hard. So we've got a list of all these things and it can be super overwhelming. And oftentimes we just end up getting stuck and paralyzed and not being able to do any of those things. So I always recommend, if you've got like this really overwhelming list and there's not like a clear priority, like the priority is not jumping out at you, do the easiest thing first. And that's not the typical advice. It's usually like that, eat the frog, do the hardest thing first. But I think sometimes doing the easiest thing, you're doing something. So your brain's going to get that tiny bit of reward and it's going to create momentum. So I think that when we can kind of, you know, understand how our brain is different than a neurotypical brain and apply advice differently, it can really help us move through our days more comfortably with these challenges that we have.
I think it's about understanding yourself, really, isn't it? It's just getting to know yourself, how your brain works,
Yeah.
what you're good at, working on your strengths as well. Um, which, as you were talking there, I was thinking of different examples where I've spoken to people and I've seen videos as well where I think getting distracted is one. I think we talked about when you get sidetracked, you set yourself a task. Okay, I'm going to go and do this and do that. And I've seen funny reels where someone goes into the house, they've left their keys, the next thing they're doing the laundry and they're doing this, they're doing that. Literally, like, they're just going to go and pick one thing up, but now they don't. Oh, I haven't put the washing on. I need to do this. I need to do that. It's being to be able to pull yourself away from those distractions, isn't it? Which is can be quite challenging. And then you lose track of time, and the next minute you're going to be late to where you need to get to, and all of that. It's like the chain of events that can happen over one little thing that you got sidetracked from.
Mhm.
How, what's your advice on that?
I mean, I think it really depends on the situation. Like with what you're describing, like I came into the house and I meant to do this, and now I'm over here doing this because I saw this thing, is learning to pause in the moment when we're doing the thing and be like, okay, why am I here? Do I want to be here? Because sometimes it's okay. Like sometimes if we have an hour and we know we have all these things that need to get done, it's kind of okay to kind of float around. And, fighting that natural tendency isn't always the worst thing, but allowing ourselves to have that, like you said, that self-awareness to be like, oh, look at what I'm doing right now. Is this okay for now? Or do I really need to be over here? Why am I avoiding sitting down at my computer? Did I just get distracted, or am I dreading this task? Like kind of
Yeah.
figuring out, having that pause. It's the pause that we sometimes lack at times, to really evaluate if what we're doing is what we want to be doing. And getting better at noticing, I think, can really help that.
Yeah, I agree with you in regard to the pause. I've spoken a lot about the pause here, and some people have like literally like pause buttons on their computers when they're working just to remind them like you need to pause because pausing allows you to give options, doesn't it? It allows you to think, it allows you to
Mhm.
reflect, it allows you to know how to proceed and things like that. Um, Going back to what we are saying about burnout, is a juggling act if you think about it. Professional demands, personal demands as well, and it can be quite tricky to juggle and prioritize what needs to be done, and which can also lead to burnout. So again, on that point, I think we touched on a lot of things and strategies that you recommended. Is there anything you want to add, particularly in terms of juggling professional and personal demands?
I think we covered a lot. I think that one thing that I really talk to my clients about a lot is that we have to understand that if you have ADHD, your brain is really driven by interest typically. So understanding that spending the time to have an on-ramp onto your day that includes doing something that's just for you, that really like you can't quantify it being productive, can actually really be super important for avoiding burnout. I like to say like bookending your days with interest is a great way to avoid burnout with ADHD, especially if you're not in a job that's like really lighting you up. If you're not, if your day to day feels a little bit like a grind, we have to not just think about um, like the strategies to get through the day. We have to think about the strategies to enjoy our day a little bit too, because there is that factor of if we're already having to use all these resources to do a lot of things we don't like, and our brain is just so bored and so not, motivated, it's going to make those things get harder and harder. So thinking about um, reframing spending time for yourself on something that's important to you as burnout prevention versus like, oh, I'm wasting time, I think is something that is really important to think about with ADHD.
The notion of dopamine rush or dopamine seeking behaviors, which again with ADHD is that's very common, where in any situation they find something boring, you're constantly seeking that dopamine rush, or you might rely. I liked this post you put a couple of weeks ago on drinking coffee, like relying on coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's something that I hear often a lot, which you can say is self-medicating, but there is this whole like you want to get this kick to kind of get you through
Mm.
whatever you need to get through. So yeah, is there anything you want to sort of say around that kind of dopamine seeking and kind of like relying on coffee, for example, to get yourself going?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to like understanding how your motivation systems work. An ADHD brain is going to need a little bit more to get that dopamine flowing to get the task done. So a typical person doesn't feel rewarded by getting their laundry done, or a typical person might feel that little reward of like, oh, I got this task done, I feel good. That dopamine comes with that feeling of having something done, where that isn't always the same for us with ADHD. Like we don't have the same type of dopamine system. So sometimes we have to like add interest to it. And that might be like if you look at your day and you're looking at it and it's like so much more mundane than normal, like you've just got a pile on of like administrative tasks or whatever it is, and you know that this is going to be a day, you're going to have to find some ways to, in a healthy way, add dopamine to your day. And that could be like maybe getting out for a walk midday, or, starting your day with some exercise, listening to some music, listening to some podcasts, taking breaks to like socialize with somebody really quickly, and not looking at that as like, oh, I'm off task, but that's going to help keep you on task, because when you have a little bit more dopamine in your brain, you can get through those harder tasks more easily. So
Mm-hmm.
dopamine seeking is a hard topic because we can't just live our whole lives just like chasing dopamine. And there's ways to access dopamine that aren't always going to benefit us in the same way, like through substances and things like that, that we have to be careful with. So we can't
Yeah,
live every day trying to have the most dopamine possible, but we do
yeah.
have to find those little breaks to kind of keep our brain happy in that way.
Okay. Before we move on to the next topic around later in life diagnosis of ADHD, you mentioned about when I mentioned consistency, you then came back with the word of persistence. That's very interesting. That got me thinking. Do you want to explain to me why you prefer persistence rather than consistency with ADHD?
I mean, I think a lot of it just comes to like having worked with a lot of clients. As soon as I say the word consistent, they're like it feels impossible because they've tried to be consistent with things a lot of times in their life. There's probably a million routines they've tried to implement. And it is much harder for us to maintain consistency. So I think when we reframe to persistence, then we don't feel like so much of a failure when we like skip a day with our routine or we fall off for a bit. If we think of persistence, it's like almost like we have this focus not on getting it right every single day, but continuing to try to layer on things that work and continuing to keep trying again. That's where the win is, in my opinion, because that consistency can very easily become like an all or nothing thing. Like I know I can't do this thing 7 days a week, so I don't want to do it at all. Whereas persistence, if you're doing the thing 5 days a week, you're still winning. So that's why I like to kind of lead with that type of focus.
Yeah, it's giving it a positive spin to it, which
Mhm.
that's the I think you're the first person who sort of said that to me. That that's why I was very intrigued that I had to go back to it. Perfect. All right. Oops, wrong button. That's it. Let's move on to talk about later in life diagnosis of ADHD, because I know obviously this is something that you wanted us to discuss, and this is something that I see a lot as well, whereby I'm seeing more and more people coming in and being diagnosed later in life. Some of them are in their 50s, some of them are in their 60s as well. Um, just from your experience, obviously, I'm sure you've got clients that have maybe come to you, maybe just wanted to find out more about ADHD in sort of later in life, or some of them had been newly diagnosed. Just from yeah, what's been your experience, certainly with clients that you've come across?
Yeah, so I actually work with a lot of people that are later in life diagnosed, or they were diagnosed early but weren't really told anything about it. Like that seems to be a common story as well. But oftentimes we have to work on two things with a late in life diagnosis. We have to work on the actual ADHD symptoms that are causing issues in our everyday life, but we also have to reframe a lot of negative stories that we've internalized about ourselves over the years. And we also have to look at how we might have developed behaviors or coping mechanisms that are no longer helping us. Specifically in my clients, I see a lot of perfectionism. I see a lot of people pleasing. And I think that usually comes from like an overcorrection, right? So if you've had all these symptoms your whole life, you don't know it's ADHD, and you kind of start to internalize that maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe, you're lazy or whatever the story is. So oftentimes I think we try so hard to overcorrect and not let anybody see these things that we think are character flaws. So we start like kind of embracing this perfectionism, while thinking it's just having high standards, but it's really causing us to burn out. It's causing us to be unhappy, and also just really not necessary in a lot of ways. So when I'm working with those clients, I see that quite often, that it's not just their ADHD symptoms that are holding them back. It's all of these other behaviors that have resulted from not understanding their ADHD symptoms their whole life.
In your experience, how does the ADHD present in later in life, just through your clients you've worked with? What are some of the traits and symptoms and challenges that they usually present with?
Yeah, so a lot of my clients are kind of getting to, there's kind of two scenarios I see quite often in terms of challenges. Oftentimes, people, when they have children and have that like life transition happen, is when things just really start to fall apart. Like a lot of the, coping mechanisms, routines, whatever they've done to get by is kind of just like we're wiping the slate blank and you've got all these new challenges. So oftentimes I see a lot of issues with women, especially being able to balance it all, and not burn out and not be able to get through the day in the way they see their peers getting through the day. I also have encountered a lot of women really struggling during like perimenopause in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, because the research isn't great at this point. We don't have a lot of information about why this is, but there's like, it's thought to be the declining estrogen levels that are happening in the body during that time. Estrogen helps you make dopamine. So if you've already got struggles with making enough dopamine, or your dopamine's being processed too quickly, as it is with ADHDers, and then you start not even having as much resources to make it, people are finding that they just don't have much left. So a lot of times, some of those symptoms just seem to be like super amplified. Like if you've had trouble focusing, you're really having trouble focusing. I think a lot of times too, if you are a combined type and you leaned on your hyperactivity to get things done earlier in life, sometimes I think that kind of starts to shift a little bit later in life as well. So you're having more of those inattentive symptoms present, and we don't always have the tools to manage through that.
When I think you touched on a good point there, where you've lived a life, you've got routines and you've got beliefs, and how to change that. Just because obviously you've got your ADHD and you're trying to get used to how your brain works, similar to how you'd work with any other clients of any age. But when you have patterns, rituals, whatever you want to call them, to be able to shift that to try and see and work in a different way can be quite challenging. To some extent, it's you have to kind of make peace with your diagnosis first,
Yeah.
understand your ADHD, similar to what we were saying before, getting to know how your brain works. Which, if anything, that could be a lengthy process for them. That could some people grieve when they hear the diagnosis at that age.
Mm.
That they might think like, they might be looking back and going like, and I got this diagnosis when I was still at school or when I was still married or, all the challenges that they had. Maybe they had jobs where they were dismissed and things like that. And again, I'm sure this is something you often hear where there's a moment of kind of going back and reflecting and kind of going, what if? What will be helpful at that stage? So if we start with someone that's newly diagnosed and still in the early stages of trying to get around and understand their diagnosis, what advice would you give them that might be struggling to comprehend and come to terms with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really typical response to have a lot of mixed feelings, right? There's a lot of, like you said, the grief can be a thing, as well as some people are really excited at first. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this makes sense," and it feels good to have that information and release yourself from a little bit of shame. But it's not usually linear. Like I find that there's moments of all of that happening. I highly recommend clients work with a therapist if they are really struggling with those pieces and the acceptance piece to get, like you said, it's hard to change anything when we're still fighting that new identity, right? So working with a therapist sometimes is a better step than going right to a coach. It really just depends on what your needs are and where you're at with processing that. A lot of times people, by the time they actually get to the diagnostic point, they've kind of self-identified for many years. So they may be at a different point. So it really just depends on the person. But I do think we have to recognize what we really need. Do we need to talk to other people with ADHD, to hear their stories? Do we need to tell our story to people? Do we need to process in that way? Do we need guidance from somebody that's skilled in helping us unpack this? I think that's really important to know that it is a big deal to get this information late in life and have all these years behind you, and that's an important step before you can start like just diving into making changes and working on those pieces.
And again, going back to your social media, do you have people like reaching out to you that are of a certain age that are maybe not heard ADHD much or not fully understood the full impact of ADHD? As we know, with ADHD symptoms, there's still quite a lot that's still misunderstood. Um, and yeah, so do they reach out to you and maybe sort of wanted to know more about it or want to kind of see how they can maybe get a formal diagnosis?
Yeah, that's actually how to get a diagnosis is probably one of the number one questions I'm asked in my private messages. It's so hard too because it's different wherever you live. So it's hard for me to give great advice on that. But I do hear that question a lot. People don't even know where to start. And it makes sense that people with ADHD would have a hard time figuring that out because it's usually navigating a health system, paperwork, waiting for appointments. Like there's a lot of executive functioning that we struggle with that has, kind of plays into even just being diagnosed. So a lot of times people are looking for that. A lot of times people are messaging me worried that they're not going to be believed by their provider, which is really hard to swallow. We all deserve an evaluation. Again, like we've talked a little bit about, there's a lot of things that can look like ADHD. So having that professional lens is really important. But a lot of times people have heard those stories about, just not even being able to get the referral. So a lot of times people are looking for reassurance that it's worth it to start that process.
Yeah. Some people might just think, what's the point? Like, I'm
Mhm.
in my 40s or 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
Some of them have retired. And it's the challenges that they probably faced when they were still at, in a working age and things. They're not really going through that. And yeah, so the question might be like, what will be the benefit of me getting a diagnosis? Certainly, we're not forcing anyone to get diagnosis that have reached a
Mhm.
certain age, but for some people, it's just the knowing that might be
Yeah.
helpful, just to know, okay, it helps them to understand, make peace. Some of them, it might be a way of explaining the challenges that they faced, which again, you can give them sort of peace. Some people have been misdiagnosed with other things, which could then
Mhm.
maybe attribute it might be ADHD for all you know, and we've seen this in clinic all the time, certainly across the board, not just with, people of a certain age, but and again, that's something I'm sure that's come up. People asking you, like, do I? Because I've been asked that. What difference would that going to make? You can say to me, I can go for therapy, or would I take medication? But I'm not having to. I'm not facing the daily challenges that I used to face when I was still at work, and you know. So yeah, what's your views on that?
I don't want to invalidate anybody's self-diagnosis or identification. And if that's enough for you and you're not seeking to get accommodations at work and you're not thinking that medication is for you, then it really just comes down to the knowing, like you said. I do tend to encourage anyone that feels like it's accessible to them to pursue a diagnosis, to pursue the diagnosis, whether or not you feel like you want to try meds or not. If again, if you're retired, maybe that's not really something like the work concern isn't there. Because we never know when life is going to change, right? So you might be doing fine, but maybe you could thrive. Who knows? And oftentimes, like if you're in a period of life where you're doing okay, but you're like, wow, all of this is making sense, and I am struggling. Like you're getting a diagnosis because you're struggling, right? At least in some level. And even if you don't want to work with a therapist at the time, or you're not eligible for work accommodations or things like that, you don't know when things are going to shift, and maybe something's going to change. And you're like, oh, wow, I need more support than I did a year ago. And then if you have to like start that whole process of getting the diagnosis when you're already at a really low point, I think it's just helpful to have that. But again, I think it's also really important to talk about that accessibility piece. I get messages from people every day that are like, I live in a country where it's like a 3-year wait, or it's very expensive to do it, and I don't have insurance or something like that. So I do like want to hold space for those people that it just truly doesn't make sense for them to pursue it. Then at that point, I think you can work on the acceptance piece and work on those, strategies like to help
Yeah.
you through and kind of act as if you have ADHD. But again, there's a lot of things that it can be. You might have a comorbidity that you need to explore. Like you having that professional eye on what you're struggling with, I think is a huge help.
And ADHD doesn't just affect work in work. It could be like relationships as much as it could be
Mm-hmm.
of any age. You getting a diagnosis, and getting the right support and treatment can also help you. Relationships can also help with your mood. If you think about emotional dysregulation, if you've
Mm-hmm.
always struggled with that, um, getting some diagnosis from that can also help to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are benefits. Again, this is obviously a personal choice, but I'm just saying that it's for anyone who's seriously considering and thinking about being put forward for it. It's definitely something
Yeah.
worth exploring. I had another point I wanted to bring up. Completely forgot, slipped my mind. It's still along. Yeah, it happens.
Yes, I completely no judgment ever on that. Yeah, if it pops up, we could get to it. But
Yeah,
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 you're right.
yeah.
I think it is. I am completely in agreement that if it's accessible to you, that I do think there's value in that diagnosis for sure.
I've just remembered it. So yeah, we are seeing a generation of what I see in my clinic, because obviously we run a clinic where we assess, diagnose, and treat adults, children as well. We see more parents coming forward. To some degree, we've seen a small population of grandparents where you've had the grandchild being diagnosed and then parents speaking to their parents, and then that's triggered them because obviously it's hereditary, as we know.
Mhm.
So, and I think it's the amazing work that people like you are doing on social media, raising awareness, where the young people are becoming more aware of their ADHD, and some parents as well. They're understanding more about it, which is then leading to this whole conversation as a family, whereby it's then maybe causing or resulting in some other family members going, oh, maybe it's worth us looking into this. So,
Yeah.
yeah, which is quite good in a way. So I think we're seeing this trend. If anything, that's going to keep happening and keep going on and on. Compared to a few years back where we didn't have social media and the lack of understanding of ADHD, yeah, which I think things have moved on since then. So if anything, it's quite a good place to be.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like I was having my suspicions when I was going through the process with my daughter, but even through all of that, nobody had told me like this can be really hereditary. I just didn't have that understanding. My providers didn't tell me that. Social media is kind of where I learned that. Actually, for me, it was more like when I was in my coaching program, and all of a sudden I'm becoming an ADHD coach, and there's like 30 people in this room. They all have ADHD, and they're all adults, and they all sound just like me. Um, like, and then for me, that I was like, people need to know this because I have 10 friends that have kids with ADHD and I have my suspicions about a lot of them. Yet nobody's telling us that, ADHD doesn't just look like this 8-year-old kid that's struggling in school. It also looks like this 40-year-old mom, that has struggled her whole life, but didn't really know why. So I do think that we need to be having those conversations. I don't know if it's okay to ask you a question since you're interviewing me, but because
You're
the
fine.
clinic you run, do your providers ever suggest to a parent to look at themselves, or do they share that information about the hereditary component when
We
children are having their children or parents are having their children treated?
we do. So what we usually do, we take a full family history anyway, and usually when you ask certain questions, some parents might say, my uncle or someone else in the family's has same traits but not fully diagnosed. If we suspect a parent might have the traits, I think we just be very careful how we go about it. I think it's one, we emphasize the point about it being hereditary, and chances are that the parents, one of them, might have the traits, or someone along those lines.
Mm,
I think it's been well received. I think generally, without actually us sort of initiating it, some parents have kind of questioned it themselves. I think when you start to go through the traits, similar to what you
mm,
said about when we do assessments and you ask certain questions in relation to their child, some parents will be like, wow, okay, I was like that, or I'm still like that. They can relate. And I think the understanding of not just the typical inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, but going down into the actual symptoms and how it presents, you understand about executive functioning, the emotional dysregulation, you understand about all of those things that people don't really usually understand or
mm,
might not really associate with ADHD. The whole understanding of it then maybe causes them to go, okay, I might
yeah.
need to look into this, which then obviously causes them to want to then investigate that themselves. I know some clinics that actually screen parents. So when they're doing the screening for the young person, they'll screen the parents as well.
Okay.
Because I think it's very important. Certainly, I think when you think about any treatment that you might want to offer once the young person's been diagnosed, if you have an undiagnosed parent, and you're trying to, because they're going to be the ones going to obviously offering that support to the young person. um it might be useful to actually know and from the onset really, so that
Mm-hmm.
okay, we're faced with a parent and a child with ADHD. It's not mandatory obviously, but I think it will be useful, certainly if you think about it, when we're talking about parents anyway, that yeah, if we are doing maybe not medication as such, but if you maybe doing parent-based therapy sessions for the young person, if the parent
Mm-hmm.
themselves have ADHD, they might then struggle to implement whatever you're recommending. So
Right.
if they have ADHD and they get the treatment for that, that will make the process easier. So
Yeah, I think understanding my personal ADHD and how it presents for me has made me a better parent to my child with ADHD. Like that like cycle you're talking about, and why screening the parent is that could actually be aiding in that treatment for that child. I think that's really important because when I got my daughter's diagnosis and I looked at all the things I needed to work on with her, that was overwhelming because I'm like, how am I supposed to executive function through all of this? So I love the idea of pushing that hereditary piece in the parent education and potentially even adding additional screenings. I don't hear of that happening as much here in the US, so I'm delighted to hear that that's a focus where you are.
yeah, yeah. So um, you touched on ADHD. I think in Korea, no, what was it? Oh, entrepreneurship. Yeah, that was it. That's something that you work with, or you specialize in, do you? Like career
Yeah,
options and people that are maybe self-employed or wanted to, businesses and run businesses and stuff. And I know a lot of ADHDers that I see, some of them anyway, they have the creative mind to set up their own businesses, run their own business. Typically, you're running your own business as well, so. Um, Personally, before we just go on and just talk about advice for anyone else listening, but just for your journey in terms of setting up your own practice, how's that been for you? What were the challenges and how did you overcome them?
Um, honestly, it's this is such a like this could be like an hour podcast on just that piece, but
Oh, really?
I think that it's so funny. I love working with entrepreneurs because, like you said, we are uniquely qualified to do this type of work. It can really suit us because of the creativity piece, but also because it allows us to honor our non-traditional work styles, like our differences with focus. It can, when we don't have to live by somebody else's rules, we can make rules that make sense for us. So that piece is super helpful too. But then there's also these pieces that we have to know to look out for if we're entrepreneurs, like that interest driven brain. While I love it and we always have all these ideas, oftentimes it steers us off course. So we're like really hot on an idea, we're like going all in, we're hyper focused on it for a couple months, and then this other idea starts talking to us, and we shift gears and we abandon that one, and we can kind of stay in a cycle of not really making the progress we want to make because we're abandoning the one that got boring. So I think that that's a thing that we have to understand as entrepreneurs to look out for. And how can we like meet that need for novelty without completely like moving in a different direction every time a new idea pops up? Um, I think for me, like understanding that piece was really important. And also just that burnout piece. I know we just have talked about burnout incessantly, but I feel like as entrepreneurs, we have to understand that piece. Or we will get to a point where we have to motivate ourselves every day. There's nobody making us do it if we're an entrepreneur. So when we, start feeling apathetic or we start just like not having motivation to work in our business, we have to like see what's happening and know how to change it. And I think that that is super, super important to understand if you are a person with ADHD working in the entrepreneurial space.
I agree. I think, yeah, it's having too many ideas. I've spoken to a lot of entrepreneurs where they have too many ideas in their head. They can tell you the business plan and everything, but it's the execution of it. Some of
Mm-hmm.
it, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of preparation that needs to be done, which can also lead to them maybe just giving up or setting up too many businesses at the
Right.
same time, and some of them are failing and stuff. So, and again, going back to what I was saying about help, seeking help, asking,
Mm.
knowing where to
Yeah.
go for help. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
go,
then knowing what to
yeah,
outsource in your business, because like you're the
yeah,
idea person. That's great. That's a talent. But if we have all the
yeah,
ideas and not enough action happening, then we don't move forward, right? And that's what I see most commonly. And so if we can't ask for help or identify like the things that are best to outsource, then we get stuck. And I think that, like you said, that's where like a good coach can come in to help you like figure that out, or maybe a business partner that they have different strengths than you that can help you really
yeah.
meet some of those needs.
And I suppose when you run a business where you got employers working for you as well, people working under you and things, which for some people they've gone into those positions without having had the experience of running a business with
Mm-hmm.
employees and things, which again in itself can present all sorts of challenges. Or knowing what kind of managerial style, leadership styles that you have. There's a whole host of things. As you say, it could be a full podcast. I can probably bring you back to focus on that. Maybe we can
Yeah,
discuss more.
yeah, we definitely could get into that. Yeah, I mean, and again, like
Yeah,
the common theme I'm noticing though is the knowing yourself and
yeah,
that self-reflection and understanding our strengths, understanding how ADHD impacts us, and that for a lot of people has been the missing piece. Like they went to school, they have an MBA, they get business, they know they have great ideas, but if you go your whole life trying to run these businesses, but you don't know you have ADHD, it can be really easy to like start these projects or start these careers and
yeah,
think that you're just a big problem, like that you're just lazy and you just like, can't, it just kind of erodes your confidence over time. But if you know you have ADHD and know that this is something that you're going to have to address and keep in mind all along the way, then you can be successful in business. But so many of us are, living our lives not realizing
yeah.
what was really going on. So it can be a crucial piece of information for sure.
It's about knowing your brain. It's about knowing your strengths. Going back to what we said before when we
Mm,
discussed about burnout, it's knowing how your brain works, knowing I'm not good at numbers, I'm not good at, admin, getting people to
hmm.
kind of do those mundane tasks that you might find overwhelming, or that's going to, cause you to maybe likely to feel burnout. It's the whole understanding everything. But sometimes it
Hmm.
takes someone else to come in and kind of give you these ideas, i.e. a coach, like what you say.
Yeah.
I know there's careers coaches out there as well that can, because that's the other topic that we discussed in this podcast on careers, being undecided of what pathway to take. Yes, you've got a business
Hmm.
idea, but that's doesn't mean it's going to be successful.
Right.
And it's the persistence, going back to your words, that will be required for you to understand that there'll be, ups and downs and challenges along the way, and asking for help and knowing when
Hmm.
to, to say no as well.
Hmm.
All of that. But yeah, that's another topic that I'm really, really quite keen to discuss, because that's when I saw on your profile you put that on there, and I thought, I thought maybe we're gonna have time to discuss it today, but unfortunately, we haven't. But I would like to spend more time discussing with about that
Yeah.
next time. So that was fascinating. Just catching up with you. And well, going back to the conference, how did you find the conference, the recent international conference in Baltimore?
So this was my second year attending. Or how did I
Yeah.
find it? Like, how did I actually find it, or did I enjoy it? Sorry, I think this is like
Uh,
a
yeah.
one of
Did
those.
you enjoy it? Did you
Did I
enjoy
enjoy
it?
it? Yes. I mean, like I started answering it, and I'm like, I don't think I'm answering the right question. Yes, I enjoyed it. I
Right.
loved it so much. The best thing about the conference for me is getting to spend 3 days with a lot of other people that have ADHD. So I feel like I can just be so myself. I can go on tangents. I can forget things, and I'm not masking as much. So that I think is wonderful. Also, just being around these brilliant minds, like ADHD people are so fascinating. So being able to like listen to these talks, have these conversations with people that are just doing really important work in this field was super gratifying for me.
What was the highlight in terms of the talks themselves that you found at this conference?
Oh my gosh, that's really hard. I really loved the Clutterbug keynote actually. I wasn't expecting to like that. I was like, home organization? I'm not really that interested. That sounds boring. But she was hilarious and I loved that she really brought a message of like, wow, ADHD has had a huge impact on my life. But when I was finally able to find what I was good at and address things differently and think outside of the box, she's found amazing success. So I found her really inspiring. I also loved Dodson's talk on RSD. I've listened to him speak on RSD before, but I think that's such a big like barrier for so many of us with ADHD. So hearing his perspective was very helpful.
Yeah, so many highlights I can think of there. Yeah, the Clutterbug. I'm actually interviewing her on Thursday on this
Oh, no
podcast.
way.
Yeah. So yeah, I can't wait for that. That's going to be interesting. What intrigues me is just the personal journey, like when she was opening up about her journey to everything that, I don't want to spoil it for the listeners, but it's an interesting journey that she came from to get to where she is now. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
so much of myself in her story, and she was just so funny. So, listeners definitely tune into that one. It's going to be a good one, even if you don't want to talk about organizing your house.
and also a social media presence as well. She gives so many
Yeah.
good tips and things on getting organized. Anyway, we'll talk more about that on Thursday when I speak to her. Is there anything else you want to share with us before I let you go?
Oh my gosh, I want to share all the things, but I can't think of one just that moment. I do
Yeah.
think that as we've talked today, since we did primarily talk about burnout, I do want to just emphasize one more time that it's okay to take this seriously. Like it might feel selfish to spend additional time making sure you're exercising and eating well and sleeping and even just finding interest in your life. But I think that when we can reframe that to like, this is literally how we're productive. This is how we're going to get things done by prioritizing these things versus making those things come last. It really can be what propels you from just like surviving and staying in the cycle of burnout to being able to thrive.
Yeah, sound advice there. And yeah, thanks for sharing all the tips and also for ADHD and late diagnosis as well, which is very helpful. For anyone that wishes to find out more about you, wanted to reach out to you, do you want to tell us your social media handles or contact details?
Yeah, my main platform is Instagram and it's hummingbird underscore ADHD. And rarely a week goes by where I'm not creating in that space. I try to answer as many DMs as I can. I also have a book coming out this fall, so look for that. It's going to be called It All Makes Sense Now, Embracing Your ADHD Brain to Live a Creative and Colorful Life. So very happy to share more in that format soon.
And oh, sorry, I didn't catch that. Is that a book that you can
Yes, my
what?
book.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a
it's a
book.
book.
Yes,
Wow, wow.
yes.
Oh,
It will
wow,
be
amazing.
released sometime this fall. So working on the
Right.
edits now, really excited to get that out there. So look for that, and I'll be talking about that on my Instagram page as well, quite a bit in the next few months.
Excellent. Maybe maybe we can I can bring you back on and you can talk more about it once
Yeah.
it's been it's
Right in
out
time
and
for
we can.
conference, hopefully next year.
Oh, you'll be doing a book signing next year
Yeah,
then. I mean
yeah.
this year.
Be there at the conference and hopefully it'll be out right around that time. So that's exciting.
Wow, amazing for you. Well done. And I always admire people that want to write books and things. That's something that I've been every time I go to that conference, I come back and I go, I need to write a book. Because obviously
Hmm.
ADHD Jesse, and I was talking to him when I was at the conference, and he just wrote a book as well. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it's a lot of, more and more people are doing that. So who knows?
Yeah. Well, ADHD Jesse is a good friend of mine and his book is amazing too. So everyone should read that and you should write yours for sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, you spurred me on there. Excellent. Nice to meet you, Meredith. And yeah, so anyone wants to reach out, like what you just said there, hummingbird underscore ADHD on your Instagram. That's, I think you're much more active more on that, aren't you? So yeah.
Yes.
And we'll put your details in the podcast description as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
No problems at all. And I'll send you the link once we've edited the podcast. Do you want to listen to it first before it goes out, or do you want to just publish
You
it?
can just put it out. I trust you. Yeah, I don't need to listen to it. I will listen to it, but yeah, I don't need
Yeah,
to give
yeah.
approval or anything. That's fine.
Excellent. Perfect. Well,
But do
what
let
time
me
is it
know
over
when it
there?
is coming so I can make sure I share and just tag me in
Of course.
anything. So I
Yeah,
can make
yeah,
sure to promote it on my end.
that's fine. What time is it over there, out of interest?
It is almost 1 o'clock, 12:45.
Wow,
So it's like
wow, yeah.
it's bedtime for you.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, good to see you, Meredith.
It was good to see you. Thank you.
Take
And
care.
have a
See you
great
later.
day.
And
Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.